The United States is the third largest country in the world, and one of the most impressive when we think of its size. But if you look closer, you'll notice America's population isn't evenly spread throughout the country. This perhaps demonstrates it best. 80% of the population to the east, and 20% to the west. A very unequal distribution. But what you'll notice in it is that Texas is divided by this line as well. In fact, with an even worse distribution. If you were to draw a line from the city of Vernon all the way down to Laredo, you'll find that only 10% of the entire state of Texas lives to the west, while an insane 90% lives to the east. So for every 10 Texans, only 1 lives on this side of the line. This makes sense when you think of the major cities of Texas: Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio. They're all east of the line, while you really only have El Paso west of it. But why is this the case? Well, this is a multi-sided problem. Because if you're from Texas, you probably know that this line actually cuts through many different regions. Let me explain. This is West Texas, technically, and these are all the regions Texas actually has. But to explain this crazy 90-10 divide, we need to include the Panhandle and some of North and South Texas as well, into what we call the west side of Texas, at least for this video. Now, this area of land is about 75,000 square miles, which is a ton, and due to its size, there are some unique problems with it that other areas don't have. The first reason relates not only to Texas, but the wider US in general. If you were to look at a population density graph of the US, you'd notice that this middle area has basically no one living in it, and the West Texas side finds itself in it for the most part. And there's a reason for this. The land that now makes up the northeastern US, where the highest population concentration is, were the first parts of the country to be formally settled on and then developed as a colony before America spread west, acquiring much of the territory from the French with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. But without modern transportation, the natural landscapes of mountains, deserts, and forests made it difficult for settlers to move west in larger numbers, and it was generally not ideal terrain to live in. This was especially true for interior spots like western Texas, that have no direct access to the sea, making it hard to bring in a steady flow of supplies and boost trade. And more specifically to the southwest region, especially Texas, is that before it became a part of the US, the whole area was virtually under control of Mexico, which had recently gained independence from Spain. And while controlling Texas gave the Mexican state more territory, they were essentially ruling over a big, dusty outpost with barely anyone living there, and faced the issue of countering the native tribes. So to fix the problem, the Mexican government opened the territory to English-speaking settlers from nearby states to increase the number of people there. This worked for a bit, but religious and language differences between English-speaking, mostly Protestant settlers, and Spanish-speaking Catholic Mexicans caused tensions, and a decision by Mexico to abolish slavery in Texas led to a war in 1835, with settlers who wanted independence. Many people fled from Texas in what was known as the Runaway Scrape, and this lasted until the war's end in 1836. Although the Mexican army was defeated, there were fears Mexico's government would try a second invasion, and the annexation of Texas into the United States led to an all-out war between America and Mexico along the southern frontier. So many of the English-speaking population who had fled were reluctant to return, while a majority of the Spanish-speaking settlers moved to Mexico, and this somewhat impacted on the state's ability to keep a steady population at the time, as being known as a place of war isn't really the best advert to attract further settlement. There was also technically still the issue of Native American tribes, such as the Apache and Comanche tribes, and they put up fierce resistance to efforts by the US Army and settlers to expand into the area. The threat of attacks by native tribes had mostly stopped by the late 1800s, and sadly many tribes were forced to move away to reservations. But by that stage, the east and west coastal areas had gotten a head start in building their populations, while development in the interior of America was lagging and settler growth was slower. So today, most of the population tends to live in or near the eastern and western coastal states, which isn't of course a unique thing to the US. If you were to look at some of the largest cities on Earth, such as Tokyo, Shanghai, and Sao Paulo, you'll notice that they're all very close to large bodies of water, with very few exceptions. This is because historically, being near a water supply, whether it be ocean or vast rivers, is key to survival. Things like water supply, fishing, transportation, and trade routes were what made cities boom, at least back then. Access to navigable water meant food and raw materials could be easily brought to market, and goods manufactured in the city could be cheaply exported. But even today, water is the cheapest way to move goods, and was even more so before the Industrial Revolution. Now, of course, none of these problems are as important as they were in the last few decades, as we've seen cities like Phoenix have many inhabitants despite everything. But it was in the very beginning, and had a lasting impact on the interior of the United States, especially West Texas. Then there's the issues of the west side of Texas that are still relevant to this day. If you were to look at a map of America based on annual precipitation, you'll notice again there's a divide which harms the west side of the US. This area in Texas is extremely dry and arid because it's part of the Great Plains. But more specifically, a few factors come together to make it this way. The first being that West Texas is far from the Gulf of Mexico, which is the primary source of moist air for the southeastern states as well as Texas. By the time the moisture crosses the central parts of Texas, it's often depleted, hence why there's still some green in the middle, but not past it. The Panhandle in particular is part of the High Plains, which is basically just an elevated subregion of the Great Plains. But because of this elevation, the air is generally drier, impacting climate and moisture retention. It's the same with the topography of West Texas. The many plateaus and basins don't exactly support the movement of moist air into the region. And then lastly, there's the Rocky Mountains, which, while West Texas isn't technically in its rain shadow, it does indirectly affect the region by blocking some of the moist air coming from the Pacific Ocean that could potentially reach West Texas. As for the water supply, there's a lack of major rivers there, so as you can guess, there's basically no water there. I mean, there's the Ogallala Aquifer, but as you can see, Texas doesn't get much of it. Never mind the fact that the southern portions of it that are actually in Texas are predicted to have less than 30 years of water left at current usage. Because of this, most of the land is dry and nothing can really grow. So there's really just dry soil and sparse vegetation. This, of course, is a huge reason not to live there, because there's basically nothing there. This is only half the problem though. West Texas experiences an insane amount of wind. Because the area is so flat, elevated or not, it has few natural barriers such as trees or hills to slow down the wind, letting it travel freely across the region. And because most of this side of Texas is dry and arid, all the wind is essentially blowing as dust. Lots of it too. In fact, the infamous Dust Bowl of the 1930s, where poor agricultural practices combined with prolonged drought, which, by the way, West Texas also has, resulted in the erosion of millions of acres of soil and affected more of Texas's land than any other state, especially in the Panhandle, but also down below it too, as you can see here. Now, while dust storms of this magnitude may never happen again, West Texas still gets quite a bit of them. For example, the wind speeds in the city of Midland can reach up to 80 miles per hour at certain times of the year, and it's not ideal for anyone who suffers allergies when the winds are blowing dangerous amounts of pollen and dust. Then there's the weather. While we already know it's arid and semi-arid, the temperature can easily exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer months, while also going below freezing in winter. The West Texas region experiences intense weather changes, even during the same day. That's how you get crazy highs and lows like these in Lubbock, one of the biggest cities left of the line. This of course makes growing food even harder for the people there. But enough of this geography talk. What about the actual factors that bring people to this side of Texas? Well, if you look at Texas as a whole, they are by far the largest oil-producing state in the United States, producing almost half of the entire country's oil, according to the US Energy Information Association. They also employ around 50% of oil and gas workers in the country. Where all this oil comes from is the Permian Basin, which, as you can see, makes up a lot of West Texas. So oil is what drives basically everything here, especially in cities like Odessa and Midland. I mean, just look at these aerial photos of them. These white areas aren't towns, they're oil fields. This is both good and bad though, because we've seen whole towns explode with people, business, and infrastructure because of oil. Schools improved, roads made, all of it. This is exactly what happened with the city of Kermit. In 1924, it was essentially dead with literally only one student attending school in the country for 5 months of 1924. But in 1926, oil was discovered in the Hendrick oil field near it. The population jumped to 1,000 by 1927 and 2,700 in the 1930s. Banks opened up, housing became scarce, the school had to be enlarged, businesses came. By 1960, the city had a population of 10,500 and 260 businesses. Currently, it's sitting at a population of 5,500, which is an obvious decline, but it's still pretty sustainable for a town that started from nothing but oil. This is one of the rare cases though, because oil can be a town's greatest blessing, but it can also be its greatest curse. See, the oil industry has caused towns to evaporate as well. Take, for example, the city of Wink, started in 1926 after oil was discovered there. It's the same story as Kermit. Within 3 years, in 1929, the population officially grew to 6,000. But the actual population could have been around 10,000 to 25,000 people, it's reported. Schools were built, it received a post office, a jail, all that fun stuff. But the oil boom declined, and as a result, everyone left. So it has a population of just 800 now. There's many of these so-called boom towns in Texas that are now basically ghost towns. That's the problem with a town being dependent on a volatile commodity. When they're up, the area is lively and booming, but when they're down, people move out faster than you can say goodbye. shops close down, and construction on new buildings halt. It's not exactly a consistent industry either. There are very high highs and low lows, and when the oil runs out, so does the town. There's even a term for this, the boom and bust cycle. So at the end of the day, nobody wants to live hours away from every major city, driving through sheer nothingness without a good reason like oil and money. And even that isn't enough for some people. I mean, the drive between Midland, for example, and El Paso, Dallas, or Austin takes about 5 hours each, and there's no commercial airports in this stretch. You could instead drive to Lubbock's airport an hour and a half away, but after dealing with airport security and a 1.5 hour flight, it'll still come out to over 3 or 4 hours. Meanwhile, in the Panhandle area of the West, like I said before, the area isn't great for farming, but it is okay ranch land if you have a lot of it. The thing is though, the dust storms it kicks up get a lot of the fecal matter, making the air quality even worse, along with the smell of course. That's not to say there's nothing there either. In Carson County, there is the Pantex plant, the primary United States nuclear weapons assembly and disassembly facility, which is cool. And West Texas is still a beautiful place in terms of nature. And I mean, the stargazing in these barely populated areas are incredible due to lack of light pollution. And any state or even country as big as Texas, being the second largest and second most populated US state with about 31 million people, are bound to have these types of divides. New Zealand has an almost 80-20 divide between the North Island and South Island's population. Spain has a 70-30 divide between mostly the centre and everything else. And Australia has an even crazier divide of 95-5, with 95% of their land empty. So yeah, it's nothing too out of the ordinary. And these areas all have relatively similar reasons for being empty too. And for some West Texans, maybe it's these exact reasons, the low population and geography that attracted them there. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.